What is going on, good people? Welcome back to the channel. I hope everyone is doing well out there. Now, I know it has been a minute since my last video, but that was for a reason. I wanted to take my time because, as promised, I will be comparing the FUJI X-T50 with the SONY A7CII. And I wanted to do it right. I've spent a lot of time with these two cameras over the past few weeks, taking them to various locations, shooting photos with them in various scenarios, and even capturing some video here and there. And so I feel like I'm finally ready to give my full thoughts on these two cameras against one another. Now, just a disclaimer, I will not be going spec sheet for spec sheet, but rather I'm going to talk about the overall experience of using these two cameras and creating photos and videos with them, from feel and carry to each brand's imaging philosophy to the overall image quality and output that you can expect from these two cameras. So with that said, let's get into it, y'all. Alright, so let's ease into this comparison by talking about these cameras' bodies, builds, and overall footprints as everyday carries. Now, style-wise, they both do come in these nice two-tone black and silver colorways, though the silver on the A7CII is a little bit darker. They also do have options to come in all black if that's your thing. Size-wise, because of its DSLR body style, the FUJI X-T50 is a little bit taller, but the A7CII is a little bit wider by a few millimeters. But by far, the Sony does take the cake for being the thicker camera, especially with that grip, which in all honesty does hold a larger battery than the X-T50. And I have to say, they both feel pretty lightweight. The A7CII might be a little bit heavier, but it is hardly noticeable. Ultimately, what it boils down to is that the footprint of these two cameras, it's about the same. If you're gonna be using a pancake lens with either of these cameras, you can get away with putting them away in a jacket pocket reasonably comfortably, but you will feel the weight. Now, if you use any other lens besides a pancake lens with these two cameras, that will make them instantly unpocketable. But I will add, when I took them out for a day of shooting in my Hex Ranger mini sling, both of the cameras fit really comfortably in my sling along with my DJI Pocket 3. So both of these cameras' footprints do lend themselves well to being used with very small camera bags. Continuing with hardware, the button and dial layout of these two cameras is where they start to diverge. Now, I will say, in my opinion, the X-T50 is a little bit more user-friendly with dedicated labeled buttons and dials for things like shutter speed, exposure compensation, and of course, film simulations. While the buttons on the A7CII are a little bit more ambiguous and unlabeled. Yes, by default, things like shutter speed, aperture, and ISO are mapped to the wheels of the A7CII, but you wouldn't necessarily know that until you start playing around with them. However, the A7CII does have a dedicated PASM dial and D-pad, which I much prefer over the X-T50's drive button and joystick. Both cameras only give you one dedicated custom button, but they also both give you the option to remap other buttons in their camera software. Lastly, I will note that the A7CII is weather resistant and the X-T50 is not, but that's not really a big factor for me since I live in San Diego and I'm typically pretty careful with my cameras in general. Now, I know I said I wouldn't go spec sheet for spec sheet, but I do think it is important to compare the imaging features and hardware of these two cameras. Now, that FUJI X-T50 has a 40 megapixel APS-C size sensor, while the A7CII has a 33 megapixel full frame sensor. We'll get into image quality a little bit later, but essentially what that boils down to is the fact that the A7CII will more easily take in more light by default. Now, both cameras have crop modes that allow you to punch into the sensor in order to give you a little bit of extra reach on your photos. The A7CII has an APS-C crop mode that essentially crops down to the same sensor size as the X-T50. But instead of giving you 33 megapixel photos in its crop mode, it gives you 14 megapixel photos. Now, the X-T50 actually allows you to crop in twice, once at 1.4x to give you 20 megapixel photos, and then again at 2x to give you 10 megapixel photos. Now, me in my everyday use, I have found the crop feature very handy on both of these cameras in order to give me a little bit of extra reach, especially with prime lenses, but still be able to output pretty decent resolution photos. Lastly, I will mention that both of these cameras do feature 5-axis in-body image stabilization, so if you want to shoot handheld at slow shutter speeds, you should be good to go. Now, speaking of shooting handheld, let's talk about the in-hand shooting experience of using these two cameras. Now, I have relatively large hands, not as big as an NBA center or anything, but I can comfortably palm a basketball. And what I'll say is that overall, the Sony A7C II, it just feels more comfortable in my hands. The thicker grip allows it to rest easier in my palm, and I feel less scared about dropping it. I feel like I can apply a much looser grip on the camera and still hold on to it, versus the X-T50 where I feel like I have to keep a much tighter grip on it to keep from dropping it. Now, I fully realize that I can add an external grip to the X-T50, and I do own two. I have a leather one from SmallRig, and I have a metal and rubber one also from SmallRig. But what I'll say about that is that to me, it kind of defeats the purpose of having a compact camera, because when you do add a grip, it extends the size of the camera quite substantially in my opinion. So while I may use a grip from time to time on the X-T50, I ultimately take it off because I want to enjoy the compactness of the camera. And overall, I just think that by default, the A7C II just has a better feel in my hand. But as far as shooting with the cameras, the X-T50 definitely feels better for photography, while the A7C II feels better for video. The dials on the X-T50 make it much more intuitive for shooting photos for me, because there's less guesswork when changing settings on the fly. The X-T50 also has the tilt screen, which works much better for capturing landscape photos from the hip or from waist level. But I will say, the articulating screen on the A7C II works much better for capturing portrait shots from the hip or from waist level or from even ground level. The LCD on the X-T50 is a little bit higher resolution, and overall it is just a better quality LCD panel than on the A7C II. Also, though the resolution is about the same on both, I definitely like the EVF better on the X-T50 because it just looks higher quality. But I will say this, regardless of which one of these cameras you use, I highly recommend getting an eye cup extender for your camera's EVF. Now for video, the A7C II has a thicker grip for more comfortable shooting. It has a dedicated record button for getting into shooting video quicker versus having to hit the drive button on the X-T50. And coming back to that articulating screen, it just works better for filming yourself, for shooting portraits, and again, for getting those low angles on either portrait shooting or high angles for portrait shooting as well. But with that said, let's get into the big category, photography and image quality. Now take this with a grain of salt, but in my opinion, both of these camera brands have two very different philosophies on how image output should be, and they're trying to do two different things. Now I've heard a lot of other photographers and YouTubers talking about Sony imaging, and the word they often use is the word clinical. And I don't know if I would call it that, because when I think of clinical, I think of like a doctor's office, a hospital, somewhere cold, somewhere sterile, and I don't think Sony images are like that. Rather, I would call Sony images more commercial. I think by default, just straight out of the box, Sony is aiming to give you a clean, tack sharp image that you can use as a starting point in order to take into your editing software, apply a preset, do any other types of tweaks, and really get the look that you want. So I would say Sony aims to give you a starting point. Now Fuji, on the other hand, they want to emulate film. Even in its standard mode, the X-T50's look is based off of the film stock Provia. And overall, Fuji images are a little bit softer, the highlights and shadows blend a little bit better, and overall, Fuji images give more of a narrative film type of look. Now, I know you heard me say the images are a little bit softer, so I want to clarify something really quick. Softness or sharpness is not the same as in focus or out of focus. You can have something that is in focus and a little bit soft, and you can have something that's out of focus but super sharpened, aka smartphone photos. So let's not get those mixed up. Fuji aims to reduce digital sharpness in order to give more of a film look. I'm not gonna say photos coming from the X-T50 look exactly like film, but I feel like it's like film, full digital, Fuji. And so while Fuji aims to achieve the film look by reducing digital sharpness, Sony leaves it in there in order to keep that digital look going, but still provide a very clean image. Neither approach is wrong, it's just two different points of view. Even with their different philosophies, both cameras produce very high quality images straight out of the box. The autofocus on the Sony is definitely better, but I feel like you could say the same thing regardless of what camera brand Sony is going against. Sony is just the best. The hit rate on my X-T50 was was pretty good for autofocus. You know, I didn't really have any problems, but overall, the Sony just had a higher hit rate and it focused faster. Let's face it, Sony is just king of autofocus. The A7C II was also better in low light, and I attribute that mainly to the full frame sensor versus the APS-C size sensor on the X-T50. The Sony images tended to be cleaner and having less noise, and I will say this was a moment where the saturation of the images in the Sony actually benefited better for low light photography. Now, speaking of colors, in general, the colors on the X-T50 were better. I felt so much more confident just taking the photos straight out of camera without doing any editing and just getting ready to share them, versus the A7C II, where I knew I wanted to go back and do some editing of its standard photos. But outside of standard photos, this is where it gets interesting. Now, as you know, the X-T50 and Fuji in general, they do have film simulations, and it also allows you the ability to create film recipes via the recipes provided like on Fuji X Weekly, or if you want to experiment with your own, which kind of extends the color advantage of the X-T50 even more beyond the A7C II, which is something you would think. However, Sony has implemented a new feature on their A7C II called Creative Looks. Now, this is their version of film simulations. It's not as robust, but it does give you quite a bit of granularity in order to tweak the image coming out of the Sony A7C II. With Creative Looks, I can go in and select a look. They have about 5 standard, but then you can also start customizing. And so I can tweak things like contrast, I can tweak highlights, I can tweak shadows, I can tweak sharpness, I can tweak the amount of fade, I can tweak clarity. And so what this allows me to do is tweaking those things in the Creative Looks and pairing that with making adjustments in the white balance of my photos and really pushing things over to like the greens, the magentas, the blues, so on and so forth. You can come out with some pretty creative looks that really look good straight out of camera for the A7C II. And so while it's not quite to the level of film simulations or film recipes, the A7C II has life when it comes to creating photos with more character straight out of camera without having to do any editing. And speaking of editing, both of these cameras produce really high quality raw files, so these files can easily be pushed in your photo editor like Capture One or Lightroom, and they're very malleable, so you can basically do anything you want to do with the color. You can push them pretty far, and they hold up. They're pretty good. Now, overall, I'd say I'd still enjoy photography more on the Fuji X-T50 as far as the usability and the image quality that's coming out straight out of camera. However, I will be experimenting more with those creative looks on the A7C II to see if I can get a closer workflow to what I have with the X-T50 for, you know, just being able to shoot and share immediately without doing much editing. Now, video is a little bit of a different story. I definitely think it is better on the A7C II. Both cameras do produce really high quality video. On the A7C II, the max resolution you can get is 4K, while on the X-T50, you can get up to 6.2K with a crop. And no, it's not open gate, but you can get 6.2K on this. Both cameras do shoot in 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second in 4K. But the X-T50 does give you up to 240 frames per second in HD, while the A7C II only gives you 120 frames per second. They both do shoot 422 10-bit. The Fuji does have F-Log and F-Log2 for that, while the A7C II has S-Log, S-Log2, and S-Log3. But the A7C II has dual base ISO, which is so useful for getting clean imagery in low light when you're shooting video. And so that dual base ISO is 800 and 3200 versus the 500 ISO in F-Log and the 1000 ISO in F-Log2 as from a base. But aside from log, I will say the X-T50 does allow you to shoot video using your film simulations. So if you want to have more of a workflow where you're just shooting and then downloading the video and then sharing, it's already color graded for you because you've used the film simulations. The A7C II also has that with S-Cinetone, but it is only one color graded profile versus the many film simulations on the X-T50. Yes, the A7C II does have a few other profiles besides S-Log and S-Cinetone, but those I'm not too sure how good those are. I'm just gonna be honest. I don't use them that much. Y'all can experiment with them if you want to, but for me, I mainly stick to S-Log and S-Cinetone. Now lastly, and this is most important, the difference in the screens when it comes to video. Now, the A7C II has the fully articulating, so if you wanna film yourself, if you wanna vlog, you can do that, while the X-T50 only has the tilt screen. And so if you wanted to film yourself, you could do it. You could point the camera at yourself, align yourself center frame with the lens in order to make sure you're in frame, but you're not gonna be able to check how you look in the image. So things like being able to check your exposure, you're not gonna be able to see that while you're filming yourself. And so, you know, it's a little bit more friendly with the A7C II than it is with the X-T50. Okay, so this is the Sony A7C II. Now I have the Sony 16 to 35 millimeter f4G lens on it, and I am shooting at f4. And yeah, we got the flippy screen here. I can check my exposure, make sure I'm exposed correctly, make sure that I am in focus. I am shooting at the first base ISO of 800 in S-Log 3. This is with the window light hitting my face, and then this is me backlit to see how I would look, you know, in the shade. And so this is just kind of how it looks. I also got the DJI mics connected to it, so this is about how it would sound with the DJI mic connected. And yeah, this is the A7C II. All right, so now I'm on the FUJI X-T50 where I'm filming at 4K, 24 frames per second. I have my shutter speed set to 1/48, so I got that 180-degree shutter rule going. I'm using the Sigma 10 to 18 millimeter f2.8 lens on it. Don't worry, I have stopped down to f4 in order to be comparable to the Sony lens. And yeah, this is how the look goes. I got my DJI mic connected to the camera, and this is what a vlogging experience would kind of look like. I can't see if I'm in focus or not. I got face eye autofocus turned on, and I also can't see the exposure on my face, so I don't know if I'm too light, too dark. This is me with the window light hitting my face, and then this is me backlit. So how do I look? Do I look good? Do I not look good? How is the image quality on the FUJI X-T50 shooting at 4K 24 frames per second? But overall, I have to say, between the two, I actually prefer shooting video on the A7C II. I think with the S-Log and the dual base ISO and the flip screen, it's just better for my workflow. I know the X-T50 is good, but overall I prefer the A7C II. But I will say, I am curious to see how I'll feel once I get the Fuji X-M5 in-house. But yeah, y'all, that's my comparison of the Fuji X-T50 and the Sony A7C II. I think both of these are great cameras that can produce some really high quality photo and video. I think if you're the type of shooter or you're the type of photographer, videographer that values a more streamlined workflow between shooting, downloading, and sharing, I think the X-T50 will be a better bet for you because there will be less editing. You can get a really good image straight out of camera without having to do too many tweaks, and you can share it on the go. Now, I think if you value a more professional workflow where you're gonna shoot, you're gonna edit, apply your own customized, specialized presets in your photo or video editor, and you just want overall more high quality video that is gonna be cleaner, look a little bit more professional, I think the A7C II would be the better choice. It's definitely more suited to someone who wants to level up and get a little bit more closer to a more professional workflow. Now, I should also mention that at the time of this recording, the X-T50 is selling for about $1,400, while the A7C II is selling for about $2,200. And APS-C lenses are typically cheaper than full frame lenses. And so overall, the X-T50 will be a little bit cheaper kit, and your money will go a little bit further for you. But either way, in my opinion, picking either one of these cameras is money well spent. But with that said, that will about do it for me. If you like this video, go ahead and drop this video a like. If you have not subscribed already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. While you're down there, go ahead and hit that notification bell. And until then, I will catch y'all later.